Hi there, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is you're watching this. This is Left Side of the Aisle. I'm Larry Erickson, your host, your ranter, your raconteur. And for the next half hour, I'm going to be trying to tell you about some things that I think you should know about and maybe you want to care about too. As always, any reactions to the show, send them to me directly to my personal email, which is Whoviating, WHOVIATING at AOL.com. Or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be over here a few times during the show. You can get the email address from there if you'd like, or you can leave a comment there if you'd rather. If you do send me email, as always, I have just two requests. One is that you include something in the subject line that makes it clear this is not spam. And two, be a little patient about getting an answer because I just take forever to answer my email. So, with that done, let's get to it. I like to start, as I always like to start whenever I possibly can, which I pretty much manage to do pretty much every week. Start with some good news. I've spoken several times about net neutrality. This is the principle that all traffic going across the internet is treated equally. That every byte is the same as every other byte, with no special privileged treatment, no fast lanes for people with the means to pony up the extra bucks. A couple of months ago, the public interest scored big on this front when the FCC reclassified broadband as a public utility subject to regulatory control, just like a regular landline telephone service is. That empowered the FCC to regulate broadband and to impose, require, I should say, net neutrality. They took that vote on February 26th. The rules were published in April. They were scheduled to go into effect on June 12th. And of course, as soon as the rules came out, also came the corporate-funded suits to toss out the rules before they could even get started. As part of that, these corporations wanted the courts to issue a stay, barring the FCC from enforcing the rules while the case proceeded. The good news here is that on June 11th, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia flatly refused to do so, finding that the corporations and their trade associations had failed to meet the basic requirements for getting such a stay, which included proving irreparable harm from having the rules go into effect. In other words, the court found that these corporations could not prove that net neutrality rules would harm them in any way. FCC Chair Tom Wheeler, his past life as a lobbyist for the telecommunications industry, perhaps safely behind him now, called the ruling a huge victory for Internet consumers, which it is. Net neutrality is now the law. And as so often happens on these rare occasions when we actually do succeed in reining in the corporations, time will surely reveal that all the predictions of disaster that are always the cry of the corporations whenever regulations are proposed, that such predictions of disaster will prove to be, as they usually do, vapor. And that will be good news. No, actually, on the other hand, it will be good news if we get that far, because there is a footnote to this. Because of the corporate lackeys and law firms failed to do in court, the corporate lackeys in Congress may succeed in doing. On June 10th, the Financial Services and General Government Appropriations Committee of the House of Representatives passed out its appropriation bill for fiscal 2016. One item cut the budget of the FCC by 20%, down to about $315 million, and it includes a provision saying that none of those funds can be used to, quote, implement, administer, or enforce the rules on net neutrality until 3 corporate-driven legal challenges are finally settled, which of course could take several years. Simply put, this is a cheap backdoor attempt to do the bidding of the telecoms and block net neutrality, and doing it in this sneaky way, buried deep in a $20 billion appropriations bill, because they know that the public, including in fact overwhelming numbers of people who call themselves conservative, the public favors net neutrality, which means these people in Congress, they really are quite shameless. All right, we got another bit of good news, though, we can go to. In 2011, North Carolina adopted one of the nation's most extreme and extremist anti-choice laws, part of which required a woman seeking an abortion to have an ultrasound done at her expense by a physician who would be required by law to display the sonogram to her and describe the fetus to the woman. Ridiculously, the bill's supporters said that the woman could just look away and not listen if she didn't want to have the procedure, which she still had to pay for. In December 2014, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals knocked down the ultrasound requirement in no uncertain terms. It found it a violation of the doctor's constitutional rights of free speech. The requirement was, and these are all quotes, the requirement was ideological intent. It was clearly intended to convince women seeking abortions to change their minds or reassess their decisions, and imposed a virtually unprecedented burden on the right of professional speech. The state declared that, again quoting, the court cannot commandeer the doctor-patient relationship to compel a physician to express its preference to the patient. The good news right here, on June 15th, the Supreme Court refused to hear North Carolina's appeal of that decision, leaving the Circuit Court decision as the final word on the matter. So at least the women of North Carolina are freed of that burden, and physicians of North Carolina are no longer required to be sock puppets for the state. The downside to this, because there always seems to be a downside to everything these days, is that the decision does not affect any of the other so-called and falsely labeled informed consent provisions of the law, which include forcing doctors to explain the risks of abortion, to discuss alternatives, and to tell the woman she can visit a state-sponsored website which describes the fetus. Those were not issues before the court, so this ruling had no impact on them. On the other hand, we have some footnotes to this, too. We have 3 footnotes, in fact. One is that the issue is much bigger than North Carolina. According to the Guttmacher Institute, North Carolina is just one of 23 states, mostly in the South and the Midwest, that have passed laws dealing with a required ultrasound for women seeking abortions. 2, and this is the thing, whenever I hear about one of these laws saying doctors have to explain the risks of the abortion procedure to the patient, I often wonder how a supporter of such laws would respond to a proposed amendment which would require those same doctors to also fully inform their patients about the risks of pregnancy, childbirth, including postpartum issues, and parenting, which are in fact far more serious and far more likely to occur than any risks arising from getting an abortion. Third, on a sort of good news note here, a recent Gallup poll shows Americans declaring themselves pro-life as opposed to the nonsensical, I'm sorry, let me correct that, Americans declaring themselves pro-choice as opposed to the nonsensical term pro-life, which at least the leaders of that position are not. But Americans that are declaring themselves pro-choice by a statistically significant margin for the first time since 2008. All age ranges have shown a significant increase in pro-choice opinion in that time. Various people have suggested various reasons for this, but personally I can't help but think that one of the reasons is all of the, again, extreme and extremist laws and rules and regulations and requirements that the rightists have tried to impose on women, leading various people to think, you know, this has really gone too far, and to sort of reassess their position and to pull back from the wackos. And again, that would be good news. Okay, moving on from there. Last week, I gave you what was then the most timely update on the question of Barack Obama getting Trade Promotion Authority, or Fast Track as it's known, on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the massive, still secret trade deal looking to unite 12 Pacific Rim nations involving about 40% of the world's economy into a single massive free trade zone. Unfortunately, the one thing I couldn't tell you on that was about how the vote on Trade Promotion Authority would turned out, because it was to take place on Friday, 2 days after I recorded the show. So even though events were moving quickly, I basically had to move slowly. I was left behind by the requirements of scheduling. But now it's this week, and in case you've been asleep for the last several days, I'll tell you how it turned out. Now, I mentioned last week again that Fast Track had become even more controversial in the House of Representatives because of a move to finance extension of Trade Adjustment Assistance, or TAA, which is intended to help workers who have been displaced, who've lost their jobs because of trade pacts. A move to finance the TAA with a $700 million cut in Medicare. Now, the pro-TPP gang tried to finesse this issue by saying they would hold two separate votes, one on trade assistance and one on Fast Track. And I said last week we'd have to see how that worked out as a tactic. Happily, it didn't. The rules of debate required that both bills, trade assistance and Fast Track, had to pass in order for this actually to proceed and to go on for final approval. Well, with unions, environmentalists, privacy advocates, consumer groups, healthcare groups, family farmer associations, civil rights groups, and even church groups pushing for its defeat. When the Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill came up for a vote on June 12th, it went down to a resounding defeat, 302 to 126. The GOPR leadership in the House insisted on then proceeding with the vote on Fast Track, even though that was now actually symbolic. That did pass by the narrow vote of 219 to 211. Now, corporate media had a storyline ready to explain the failure of Fast Track. It was all gasp, shrink in horror, the fault of gasp, shrink in horror, big labor. And they said it sometimes in very revealing language. For example, USA Today said House Democrats are opposing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, quote, for a simple but not very good reason. Labor has pulled out all the stops to persuade, cajole, and pressure them into killing it. Adding later that blocking the pact, quote, would be widely interpreted as the Democrats put in the interest of unions first. Oh my God, how horrifying, how disgraceful. The Democrats, not all of them, I have to say, not all of them, but enough of them, supported the interest of their core constituency. They put the interest of ordinary working people ahead of those of transnational corporations and international banks. My gosh, how dare they? Remember what I keep telling you about how these people are not on your side. Sometimes the mask slips, sometimes it slips a little further. Anyway, getting back to the vote itself, what that symbolic vote on Fast Track did was give the pro-corporate lobby in the House, which is, in fact, the pro-corporate lobby that is the House leadership, a basis to push for a revote the following week, which would be this week. That revote never came, or to be more exact, it has not come. Instead, on June 16th, the House voted 236 to 189 to put off the vote for 6 weeks until the end of July. The first thing to note is that this makes clear that the corporate lackeys in the House and in the White House still don't have the votes to get Fast Track through. And they want to give themselves enough time to cajole, confound, and coerce enough members to get the amazing Mr. O the banker-pleasing power that he wants in order to get this trade deal through. In fact, they want to give themselves all the way until the summer recess to do this, which indicates they know this is not going to be easy. It also means, by the same token, that despite what happened on Friday, where the Trade Adjustment Assistance Bill was defeated so resoundingly, despite that, this is not over. Fast Track and through it, the Trade-Pacific Partnership have been wounded, badly wounded, but this is not over. Still, there are some additional hopeful signs that some of the other nations involved are getting rattled. Australian Trade Minister Andrew Robb said that things are getting quite problematic. And in fact, some people say it appears that the Australian government is on the verge of just admitting defeat on the whole deal. Meanwhile, Singapore's Foreign Affairs Minister, his name is K. Shanmugam, he's saying that U.S. credibility in the Asia-Pacific region is on the line. And you always know when somebody pulls out that line, which in context usually translates to, you have to go ahead and do this stupid thing so that people will believe you when you want to do the next stupid thing. Whenever somebody pulls out that line, you know they are desperate. What all this means, in sum, is that Fast Track, again, is not dead and the fight isn't over. Is it ever? But Fast Track, and by that means the entire Trans-Pacific Partnership, that entire deal, can be defeated. We can do this. And two footnotes to that were rather heavily footnoted this week, I see. There are two footnotes, one serious, one just for fun. The serious one is that another possibility under discussion in the House for how to deal with voting on Fast Track in the coming weeks would be to decouple it from the worker assistance provision entirely and just vote for a bill that only includes Fast Track authority. If that happened and it passed, it would mean the Senate, which has already passed its own trade package, would be in the position of negotiating with the House for a final deal, final package, that did not include worker assistance that Democrats have backed for 4 decades. The word is that the White House might quietly encourage this strategy, that is, dropping trade assistance from the bill altogether, in order to get the trade deal done. The New York Times called this an odd twist, but it didn't surprise me at all. Last week, I talked about how, for the sake of the TPP, Obama was prepared to close his eyes to Malaysia's involvement in international slave trade. So what's the big deal about the domestic detritus of our deals? The fun footnote here is that Bloomberg.com ran down how declared and expected to declare presidential candidates of the two major parties stand on the TPP. Some of them were yes, some of them were leaning yes, some of them were no, some of them were leaning no, and when you came to Bernie Sanders, it was hell no. You may not agree with the man's politics, and I will admit I agree with a great deal of it, and some things a little too conservative for me. But you can't say that you don't know where the man thinks. We are going to take a break. Hi there, and we're back. And we're back, actually, with a bit of news about our lovely little war in Iraq and Syria. Last week, I told you about how our Nobel Peace Prize Prez is sending 450 more U.S. troops to Iraq to establish a new base, a new training facility in Anbar province. This week, I can tell you that General Martin Dempsey, who chairs the Joint Chiefs of Staff, called the new base a natural extension of U.S. assistance that could serve as a model to be replicated elsewhere in Iraq, involving, of course, then even more U.S. troops. He said the idea for such additional bases is under consideration all the time. He called such bases lily pads, from which apparently Iraqi forces, not U.S. forces, no, of course not, never U.S. forces, but from Iraqi forces could, I don't know, apparently hop forward or something. Dempsey said he has not recommended putting U.S. troops closer to the front lines in order to call in airstrikes, but he pointedly held out the possibility, saying, quote, "We continue to plan for and ensure that that option is available." Now, in response to the announcement of additional 450 troops, several of the war hawks invoked what they called the lessons of Vietnam. Those lessons being, as near as I can figure from the rambling of their aging brains, nuke them, or at least bomb them back to the Stone Age. But of course, they're not prepared to be quite that honest about their desires, so they just refer to some form of go in big now. But of course, they won't put their vote where their mouth is, and as Congress continues to dodge any sort of actual responsibility for this. Thus, on June 11th, the House of Representatives rejected an amendment to a defense bill that would have forced lawmakers to vote on a formal authorization for the use of military force against ISIS. The amendment, sponsored by Adam Schiff, would have required Congress to vote on a new authorization by March 31st, 2016, or no military funds could be used to conduct airstrikes or anything else against ISIS until and unless Congress passed this authorization. It was voted down 231 to 196 because the last thing the majority of those war hawk cowards wants to do is to actually have to say yes or no to war, to actually have something in record that can be pointed to, as opposed to just sniping about how a war is conducted from the safety of their press releases. One other thing, in referring to his lily pads, Dempsey said, "Is this a game changer? No, it's an extension of an existing campaign." You know, I recall the lessons not of the Vietnam War, the Indochina War, rather differently than the war hawks. I recall, for example, that among the lessons the government learned, one which Dempsey apparently recalls well, was when you're changing your policy, say you're not. And when you're not changing your policy, say you are. Oh, and speaking of Vietnam, we have an anniversary this week, June 16th. June 16th, 1961, news item. Following a meeting between South Vietnamese envoy Nguyen Dinh Thuan and President John F. Kennedy, the United States agreed to increase the presence of American military advisors in Vietnam from 340 to 805 and to provide direct training and supervision to South Vietnamese troops. The number of U.S. personnel rose to 3,200 by the end of 1962. Like I said before, watch this space. All right, now we move on to the Clown Award, one of our regular weekly features given, as always, for meritorious stupidity. The Big Red Nose this week goes to Tim Hunt. Now, who's Tim Hunt? Well, he's a biochemist. He actually won the 2001 Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine, and he's an unapologetic sexist toad. On June 8th, at the World Conference of Science Journalists in Seoul, South Korea, he told his audience that he had a reputation as a male chauvinist and then went on to prove it, saying, and I'm quoting, "Let me tell you about my trouble with girls. 3 things happen when they're in the lab. You fall in love with them, they fall in love with you, and when you criticize them, they cry." In the classic non-apology, Hunt later actually stood by his comments, saying he did mean the part about having trouble with girls, but insisted, "I'm really, really sorry I caused any offense. I certainly didn't mean that. I just meant to be honest." Yeah, right. You call them girls, say they can't deal with criticism, imply they don't belong in a research lab, but you didn't mean any offense by any of that. I mean, how can anybody find that offensive when you were just being honest? Honest about being a chauvinist toad, yes, but beyond that. The fact is, while there has been measurable progress, gender bias and discrimination remain a real barrier for women in academia, particularly in the area known as STEM, which stands for Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics. For example, in 2012, 62% of the men in academia were tenured compared to only 44% of women, and women were far more likely to be in non-tenure track positions than men. In 2013, women earned about half of the bachelor's degrees awarded in science and engineering, 38% of the doctorates, but made up only 26% of tenured professors. A study in 2012 revealed that chemists and biologists are likely to favor a young male scientist over a young woman with the equivalent credentials and are more likely to offer the man a job. And when women do get hired, their pay averages $4,000 a year less than what men are paid. None of this seemingly matters to Tim Hunt, who's only being honest about disruptive, weepy women in his lab. As the UK newspaper The Independent noted, with lab rats like him, isn't any wonder there is a shortage of women in science. Oh, but, you know, got to tell you, it's really, really okay, because Hunt said that he didn't want to stand in the way of women. He just was in favor of single-sex labs, you know, academic apartheid. No, but considering that a good part of his complaint was about disruption caused by romantic involvements in the lab, apparently he has little self-control on this, but his complaint was about disruption caused by romantic involvements. By his own logic, wouldn't you also then have to ban gay men and lesbian women from those labs, those same-sex labs? The pushback against Hunt was hard enough. Even the Royal Society, which is the United Kingdom's leading scientific organization, and of which Hunt is a member, even the Royal Society distanced itself from him. It was hard enough that he lost his honorary post at University College London. That's okay, though, because Tim Hunt can always pursue another career as a clown. All right, last up. Here's something I bet you didn't hear about, and it refers to the outrage of the week. It's a 2015 review conference of the parties of the Treaty of Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, the NPT. It took place at the UN from April 27th to May 22nd. And of course you didn't hear about this. There basically was no news coverage at all. But over 100 nations came together to discuss the state and progress of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the main international device to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons. Now, that would seem to be a laudable enterprise, despite the continuing danger found in the fact that 8 nations admit to having nuclear weapons. The total number of nuclear weapons is estimated at over 17,000, 16,000 of which are in the hands of just 2 nations, the U.S. and Russia. But instead of making progress or just issuing even a bland motherhood and apple pie consensus statement, the conference broke down in disarray and angry exchanges, sufficient to, in the judgment of Joe Gerson of the American Friends Service Committee, shake the foundations of the NPT. Why? How? Because, again, in Gerson's words, the U.S. sabotaged the conference by blocking the conference consensus statement because it included a call from Egypt to convene within 6 months a conference aimed at establishing a nuclear-free zone in the Middle East. Why would the U.S. want to sabotage that? One real clue was found in the fact that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu thanked the U.S., along with, let it be said, the U.K. and Canada, for undermining the proposal. Because, you see, a nuclear weapons-free Middle East would mean a nuclear weapons-free Israel. Israel, with an arsenal estimated any from 80 to as many as perhaps 200 nuclear warheads, is the only state in the region with such weapons. It denies having them, but everyone knows that's a lie. In fact, even the Israeli denials now are made more with a smirk than any real conviction. It is the only state in the region with nuclear weapons, and it obviously intends to keep it that way. And the U.S. is prepared to be Israel's enabler, even if that means threatening the very structure of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which has at the very, very least limited the spread of nuclear weapons. Yes, there are 9 nations, when you include Israel, that have nuclear weapons. Before the NPT, the estimates were that by this point, there would be 30. So ready is he to run interference for Israel and the international community. Barack Obama, and let's take a moment to remember that one of the reasons he got his Nobel Peace Prize was his supposed commitment to getting rid of nuclear weapons. Barack Obama is so eager to run interference for Israel that he's prepared to risk the entire structure of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which leads me to wonder which of his other principles Obama is not prepared to throw over, and to express my outrage at his abandonment of this one. That's it. I'm out of time. Let me get out of here. We'll see you next week. Have the best week you can. Peace.